Never forget the time that a young couple walked in to our home, actually. Lois and I had done their preparing for marriage sessions. We had spent a number of hours with them, spread over several months. And they came to see us a few months after their wedding. And what came out of them was this burning question and frustration over their sexuality in their marriage. And they were a young married couple. And I remember this sinking feeling in my gut because it was like God was speaking to me while they were talking to us. And I knew that one of the things that had factored into this relationship is that they had failed to communicate. They had failed to have heart-to-heart, honest, open conversations. And they were both extremely frustrated because of the way the sexual part of their relationship had turned out and was turning out. And we got them some help. We talked with them. And I just want to say to you, my friends, because I've had several conversations, phone calls, text exchanges, emails in the last couple weeks about what we've been talking about. And people have said, well, what about this and what about that? And I've said, you need to talk. You just need to have a conversation, an open, free, honest conversation. And how come is it that especially for the lives of Jesus followers, sexuality has become a topic that we go, shh, we don't need to talk about that. It's crazy. God created this. And we're going to talk about part of this today, but I want to remind you of the truth of what Paul teaches us and what Jesus teaches us about relationships. And that is every one of our relationships, every one of them is in one way or another a reflection of God's relationship with us. And if we're not treating those relationships with that kind of value and that kind of significance, we're missing the point, my friends, in every way, whether that's a marriage relationship, a relationship with a coworker, whether it's a relationship between a student and a teacher, between siblings, whatever those relationships are, we need to treat those relationships as valuable because they're a reflection of God's relationship with us. And so one of the things that is so important in all this is, that means you need to work on your relationship with Jesus. It doesn't just happen. It requires effort on our part to be in a relationship with Jesus because he wants to be in a relationship with us. That's why he says to us and to his disciples on the night before he was betrayed, he says, if you know me, you know my Father. Do you know that if you know Jesus, you know God the Father? If you know Jesus, you know God the Father. So do you know Jesus? That's the burning question. Some of you know the story, and many of you don't. But on January 8th, 1956, there were 5 missionaries who attempted to contact a tribe in Ecuador that had never had any gospel witness. And all 5 of those men were martyred for Jesus that day. One of them, his name was Jim Elliot, left a detailed journal. And on the morning of the day when he and his 4 friends lost their lives, to this violent tribe that was totally afraid of outsiders. This is what Jim Elliot wrote. He wrote, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep in order to gain what he cannot lose." He's no fool who gives up what he can't keep anyway to gain what he cannot lose. You know, my friends, if you are a follower of Jesus, if you've made that commitment to follow Jesus, if you've declared him to be the Lord of your life, if you've confessed your sin and repented and turned from your sinful ways, you gain something that you cannot lose. And does it mean we give up things? Yes, it does. But really, what Jim Elliot was saying on that morning before he died, when he wrote this out and left it in his journal, what he was saying echoes what Jesus said to us in Matthew 16. Because this is what Jesus said: "Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it." And I've said this to remind you of what we covered last week, what we covered in the previous message. And if you haven't watched that message or listened to that message, go to our website, mynorthgatechurch.com, and find that message, because it's really important. This is what Paul says to us. You are not your own. I know that sounds really radical. It is radical. Because everything our world teaches us is that you're in charge of your own life. But Jesus teaches us, and Paul illustrates it by saying to us, you are not your own. You were bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. And we could fill in any number of things there, couldn't we? Honor God with your words, honor God with your actions, honor God with your money, honor God with your time. Whatever we can fill in the blank there, honor God. So this morning, we continue in Paul's letter to the church at Corinth, where he's addressing the lifestyle in the city of Corinth that is just full of sexual immorality and debauchery. And Paul is saying to us, and we have reminded each other of this several times over the last few weeks, sex is sacred and holy. Sex is sacred and holy. So Paul, last week we talked to those of us who are married. This week we talked to those of us who are single and single again. And Paul is being very practical here. He's being very practical here. And he wants us to know and understand that everyone is a whole person. You know, we have really messed this up in the church. More than our culture, we've messed this up in the church. Because we have this expectation in the church that everybody's going to get married. That everybody needs to be married. And it's destructive. And it's wrong. Because you do not need to be married to be a whole person. You are a whole person because of Jesus in you. It doesn't require anything else. We're back to that relationship thing again. That God and Jesus want to have a relationship with us and want us to be in relationship to them. And we are whole people. So if we're single or single again, this is really important to hear. Because what Paul teaches in Romans chapter 7 is, well, this is challenging. This is really challenging. He says this. Now, about virgins, and can you read unmarried in there, please? I have no command from the Lord. But, he says, I give a judgment, advice, because I'm one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. And he is. He is trustworthy. Can we remind ourselves where this man came from? This man's name was Saul. He was one of the most highly educated men in his entire world. He was both a Roman citizen and a Jew, and because of that, he enjoyed rights and responsibilities from both those nationalities. He had, we would say today, he had dual citizenship. He had a desire to protect the Jewish faith, so much so that when Jesus' followers started to multiply after his death, he asked the religious leaders of the day for permission to go and hunt them down and clear them out. And they gave him that permission. They gave him letters, and they gave him soldiers, and they gave him clearance to go and find Jesus' followers and either get them to renounce their faith or put them to death. And as he was traveling to the first city to begin this process, because he heard that there was a gathering of Jesus followers in Damascus, he had a life-transforming experience because he met Jesus on that road. And his life was completely turned around, so much so that his name was changed from Saul to Paul. And Paul, this brilliant, extremely well-educated man, became our theologian. He took everything that he heard that Jesus had said, and he spent hours talking with the disciples and the other followers of Jesus, because there were a lot of followers of Jesus besides the disciples. He listened to them. He got the stories from them. He heard what Jesus had said, and he measured all that against everything that he'd been taught from what we call the Old Testament or the Jewish Torah. He measured all that, and he then was put in a place by Jesus, by God, to become the one that gives us a practical understanding of the things that Jesus said. And so he writes many letters to the churches in the days of in the early days of the church. He writes these letters, and they become our handbook for taking what Jesus taught and applying it to our lives in a practical, useful way. And he says, okay, I've got good judgment. I'm trustworthy. Because of God's mercy displayed in my life, you all know my story, and they did. They all knew his story. And he said, because of that, I can give you some advice. And he says, because of the present crisis, because of all that's going on, I just want you to know that I think is good for a man to remain as he is. Now the crisis that Paul's referring to is the crisis of the tremendous persecution that's come against the followers of Jesus. The pressure that's being put on them to renounce their belief that a man actually was raised from the dead. And people were being pressured to do this. They were being pressured in ways that meant they lost their places to live. They no longer had employment. If they went to the market with food that they'd raised or livestock that they had brought up, that no one bought it because they were labeled as Jesus followers. And Paul says, because of this present crisis, just remain as you are. Remain as you are. Are you pledged to a woman, he says? Either to be engaged or you're already married. Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. He says, just remain as you are. But he goes on, he says, but if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But then he lays out this truth that we don't talk about openly, and we need to talk about it more openly. And when I was reading this passage several weeks ago, and I've read it multiple times since then, I always get stuck at this verse. I do. Because Paul says it this way: those who marry are going to face many troubles, and I want to spare you. Those who marry are going to face troubles. And, we could stand here and we could spend the day listing all the reasons, all the benefits of marriage, but it would be a longer list if we talked about the challenges of marriage, the troubles that marriage brings. My wife used to have this saying that if you put two sinners together, you get sinnerlings. And when those kids come along, those kids can be a real challenge. They fight, they bicker, they argue. At the beginning it's cute because they're wrestling on the floor, but then when one of the kids stands on the back of the couch and launches himself onto the floor in the middle of the pile and somebody gets hurt, you go, oops, there's trouble. There's an incredible amount of attention that has to be given to the cultivation of a marriage. They don't just happen. It requires time and attention. It requires conversation. It requires negotiation. It requires commitment that goes beyond anything and everything. And Paul is saying, hey, look, I want to spare you from this. If you're not already committed, maybe you should consider not taking that step. And some of you are already thinking, well, I can't imagine. That just doesn't sound right. But can we go back to Matthew 16 again and remind ourselves of what Jesus said? He says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Peterson, in his translation called The Message, which I use a lot because it's so raw and real, he says, if you want to come after me, you're not in the driver's seat, I am. Don't run from suffering. Embrace it. Follow me and I'll show you how. Suffering? Run from suffering. That's what we do, isn't it? And Jesus is saying, no. Embrace it. And he says, follow me, I'll show you how. And he did. He went to the cross, didn't he? And he not only suffered on the cross, but he became victorious over the cross. And he says, follow me, I'm going to show you how this works. And sometimes we forget that Jesus is the ultimate example of authentic singleness. Jesus is the ultimate example of authentic singleness. He lived as fully God and fully human. He knew all the temptations. He dealt with all the interactions. And he did it without sin. He did it as an authentic example of living a single life. And there's nothing wrong with living a single life. I mean, my wife died, it'll be 15 years ago this coming September. And I don't know how many times I've had people come up to me and say, are you remarried? I was part of a funeral in Kansas City on Thursday. A wonderful, dear man, a long, great life as a pastor. What an amazing celebration. But I can't tell you how many times. I haven't been at that church very many times in the last 9 years because I've been here. And I used to be in that church where that funeral was, once every 6 or 8 weeks for 10 years prior to that, because I was traveling as a pastor to pastors. And I don't know how many people came up to me, "Are you remarried?" And no. Well, why not? Well, because I get to do things, and I have the freedom to do things that would end if I pursued another relationship. Because relationships take time to cultivate, to maintain, to communicate, to do all the things that happen with a relationship. And, and the next question is, well, aren't you lonely? And then I have to try to explain to them, no, I'm not lonely. I get to be the pastor of a church that in a 6-week period has about 350 people that come through our doors on a Sunday morning. And, I get to work with high school students at Pekin School on speech and drama. And I get to be a part of a caregivers group. And I get to be involved in all these things. And they, well, okay, so you don't have time to be lonely. No, I don't. I don't. I love the life that God has given me. Do I miss my wife? Yes. But you've heard me say this in the past. Some of you have heard me say this. They've said, well, wouldn't you like to have her back? Yes, but not at the expense of having to unlearn everything I've learned since she died. Because I've learned a lot. And what does that mean? It means that I have to be on my guard, that I have to set up guardrails, that I have to have standards for myself. It's why, and you've heard me say this before too, it's why I have a sign on my computer screens and below my TV at home. It says, I will set no worthless things before my eyes. I pray every day that God will fill me so full of the Holy Spirit that I will be dangerous to anyone and anything that does not acknowledge Jesus as the Christ. Because I know that I have to be on guard. I pray every day that God would break down the barriers that get erected in my mind against the truth of God, so that every thought and emotion and impulse will fit into the structure of a life shaped by Christ. You see, if we don't do that, we quickly learn that an unguarded strength becomes our greatest weakness. If we're not guarding our strengths, Satan comes at us from a different angle and he trips us up. So, the next question then becomes, if I remain single, then what do I do with the culture's message and even the message I get from my own body about sexual fulfillment? What do I do about that? So here's what you need to hear. This is taking the truth of what Jesus says about marriage and relationships and how Paul helps us apply it. And this is even more practical. Sexual fulfillment before marriage, while you're married, and after a marriage is over, when you're single again, which happens to a lot of us, it comes from three things. It comes from three things. Sexual fulfillment comes from self-control. Self-control. It requires an active participation on my part to be self-controlled. It comes from self-discipline. I have to discipline myself. You have to discipline yourself not to allow your eyes to wander to places they shouldn't be. You have to discipline yourself of what you look at on your smartphone or your tablet or your computer. You have to discipline yourself about the kinds of situations that you allow yourself to be put in. You have to discipline yourself to put the emphasis on your relationship with Jesus, not looking for your next person to conquer. And in the middle of this, we recognize that it takes a lot of sacrifice too. A lot of self-sacrifice. And that's okay, because Jesus gave up everything for us. And if I have to give up something for Jesus, it's nothing compared to what he has given up for me. So I want to share with you Jim's unauthorized version of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 25 to 28, okay? I want to share this with you. It's the unauthorized version. I claim no special spiritual insight. God didn't speak to me and give me these words. This is just the best way that I know how to explain this. The person who has prayerfully considered the matter of marriage and who is under no compulsion, in other words, they're not engaged and they're not already married. They're under no compulsion, but who understands that they have a free will. The number one thing that I think makes us created in the image of God. He has a free will to love us, and he gives us a free will as well to love him and make decisions. So the person who is under no compulsion, but who understands his free will, that person may choose to marry or remain single, and both are the right decision. Both. There is no wrong decision. And I know, because I grew up in a church and in a home where over and over again, my family and my church upbringing emphasized that I had to find God's perfect will for my life. And that somehow I had to figure that out, find his perfect will. Nobody ever told me that I had a free will to make decisions. Nobody ever told me that I could choose one way or the other way. And as long as it wasn't immoral or unethical, as long as it didn't violate the truth of God's word, that I had the freedom to make that choice, and God gave me that freedom. And somehow we have to communicate this, my friends. We have to really communicate this well to our kids, especially our teenagers. I don't want any teenager or young adult to get paralyzed by this false teaching that somehow they have to figure out God's perfect will for their life. They have to find the perfect mate that God has chosen from them from the beginning of the world. No. We have a free will. And that means that when we express that free will, we have to establish some guidelines for ourselves. Excuse me. So I want to share something with you that I have been sharing with teenagers and young adults for over 25 years. It's the list. Now, I'm just going to take a little bit of a rabbit trail because I need you to understand how significant this is. When Lois and I got married, before we ever started dating, I had a list. I'd had an evangelist that came through our church who sat me down one day. They stayed in our house, and he sat me down one day at the breakfast table in the kitchen, and he says, "You need to make a list." I was 15 years old, and he said, "You need to make a list of what you think God wants you to have in a wife." Thinking, I got other plans right now. I'm not looking for a wife. Got to make the list. Got to make the list. His name was Ralph Sutera. And so I made that list. And on our wedding night, without telling my wife that I even had this list when we were dating or engaged, on our wedding night, I gave my wife that list. Now, I just gave it to her. I didn't think that much about it. I said, "Hey, this is the list I made when I was 15 years old, and this is why I married you. This is why I love you." I didn't know how significant that was until the late 90s, when one day at high school summer camp, my wife was asked to share with the girls about relationships. I was sharing with the guys. I was down at what was referred to as a tabernacle. She had the girls around the swimming pool, and she pulled that list out because she had saved it, and she showed all these girls, and she told those girls that it was the most important gift she'd ever been given. I mean, all these girls and female staff are coming to me after, oh, you're so romantic, and I'm saying, what are you talking about? And I finally, cornered my wife and said, what did you say? And she pulled out the list out of that she'd stuck in her Bible, and she showed me. She said, I showed him the list. This can be really important. If you're single, if you are anticipating getting married, if you believe that as a follower of Jesus, that's what he's leading you to be involved in, then I want to talk about this list for a minute, because you need this list. And by the way, if you're already in a relationship, if you're already in a relationship with someone of the opposite sex, you can't work on this list. I mean, I've had young adults and teenagers, almost throw things at me. I think one time they did throw something at me when I've said, hey, if you're really committed to making this list, you got to break up with your boyfriend or your girlfriend for at least 6 months, and then make the list. So let me tell you about this list. Number one, it's non-negotiable that the person that you're looking for is a fully devoted follower of Jesus. Period. No such thing as missionary dating. No such thing as exploring relationships with people who aren't committed followers of Jesus. No, absolutely not. Done. Okay? It means that you have to be very careful about the close relationships that you develop, the close friendships you develop. Should you be friends with people who aren't followers of Jesus? Yes. How else are we going to invite them to come and join us following Jesus? Yes, we need to have friends who aren't followers of Jesus, but close friends, confidants, romantic relationships with those people? No, non-negotiable. Non-negotiable. That's got to be at the top. And then, you have to have a minimum of 10 things, and no more than 2 of those things can be physical qualities, physical appearance related. I mean, I had a teenage boy, I didn't say this part one time, and I had a teenage boy that brought me this whole list, blonde hair, and he just had all this stuff about physical appearance. And I said, you missed it. 2, maybe 2 out of 10. It ought to be 2 out of 20, but 2 out of 10. And then you list character qualities. And you talk about things like morality. What are their morals? And I'm not just talking about sexual morals, but morals, period. What kind of ethics do they have? What about their finances and their friends, their priorities? What kind of family relationships do they have? What do those look like? What kind of habits are there in their lives? Do they... does he show up at your door to pick you up and he's all clean and neat and smells good and he has all the right clothes on and he's fashionable, but he lives in a pigsty? I mean, you need to know that. What about their secrets? Have you talked about their secrets? If you can't talk about the secrets when you're getting to know somebody and dating somebody, the secrets are never going to get talked about when you're married. And, what about credibility and integrity? What about credibility and integrity? Credibility means that when you say you're going to do something, you really do it. Integrity means that you do the right thing even when nobody is watching. Overall, the question for people who are looking to be in a relationship, looking to be married is, am I becoming the person the person I am looking for is looking for? Am I becoming the person I'm looking for is looking for? See, so oftentimes we put all the emphasis on what we're looking for in somebody else, and we don't pay near enough attention to getting ourselves ready for that relationship. Am I becoming the person I'm looking for is looking for? So, I'm going to repeat this because we said this last week. Celibacy is not for everyone any more than marriage is for everyone. It comes back to this whole concept that sex is sacred and holy. It's not for everybody. And you can be sexually fulfilled without being married. And I'm not talking about watching porn and pleasuring yourself. I'm talking about practicing self-control, self-discipline, and self-sacrifice. And believe me when I tell you that that's the clue to sexual fulfillment, even if you are married. This idea, this crazy idea that the media pours out on us over and over again, that sex is supposed to be spontaneous and wild and crazy, and that it takes alcohol to make it good, or it takes some other substance to make it better. That's foolishness. That's foolishness. It takes self-control, self-discipline, and self-sacrifice. Why? Because your body is a temple, is a residence for the Holy Spirit. If you're a follower of Jesus, your body is. So, just let me remind you of some of the foundation stones that we laid before we started talking about sexuality in marriage or with or for single people. Number one is you need to be offended by your own sin before you're offended by the sins of others. You need to be offended by your own sin first. Take the board out of your own eye, says Jesus, before you work on the splinter in somebody else's eye. And my friends, that's tough, okay? That's tough. It means that I'm open and honest, especially if I'm a parent with kids, or a grandparent with grandkids, or an uncle or an aunt with nieces and nephews, or a next-door neighbor to somebody I have a lot of influence over, or the teacher in a classroom. My friends, we have to be honest and open, and we have to acknowledge our sin. I think one of the hardest things we do is having that 15-year-long conversation with our children while they're growing up, and coming to the place where we have to sit down with them and say, I don't want you to do what I did or what we did. I don't want you to make that mistake. Whatever the mistake was, living together before you were married, having sex before you were married, whatever it is, kids need to know that you really do want them to avoid those mistakes, that pain. And that's being offended by my own sin before I'm offended by the sins of other people. We have to reclaim this whole subject and this whole teaching. And it takes our full attention to do this. It takes our open, honest reactions before each other, but especially before our kids and grandkids. So here is what we said at the very beginning that is so significant for our understanding of Paul's letter to the church at Corinth. He starts the whole thing out by reminding us that we should never forget that God will never give up on us. Don't ever forget that God will never give up on you. ever. He'll never give up on you. No matter how hard it gets. No matter how hard it gets in marriage or before or after marriage. He'll never give up on you. He'll never give up on me. He loves us. He sent his son to die for us. So my friends, I want to end with this kind of footnote disclaimer. If this is a struggle for you, if this is an area of your life where you're really struggling, if you have, a whole list of questions because of what we've talked about the last few weeks, would you please, reach out to me? I have a ton of resources available to you, even as parents. If you want to know how to have that 15-year-long conversation with your kids, I got resources. I can put them in your hands. I have a list of qualified therapists, not very many in this area. You might have to travel, to Iowa City, Cedar Rapids, or Des Moines, but it would be worth it because there are therapists that can help. I don't want you to walk out of this service or walk away from this teaching or turn off your computer after this video is over and say, well, that was nice, but it doesn't apply to me because I don't know how to make this work. No, call me, text me, email me, whatever it takes, my friends, because this is an area of our lives that if we can get this right, think of how it impacts the next generation and the generation after that and the generation 3 times down. This is so important for us as Jesus followers to get this right, that we dare not ignore it. So if you have questions, if you have concerns, please, please, please reach out. And it doesn't have to be just me. There are other people in this household of faith. There are other therapists. You know that there are resources out there. Just don't keep it bottled up inside and ignore it, please. And never forget that God will never give up on you.